This is a little bit of an expansion on the video I did about virtue signaling, which touches on another subject that most shows wouldn't dare talk about today. There are two episodes of iconic cartoons I watched as a kid that engaged with this particular subject. One was an episode of Proud Family, the other was an episode of Powerpuff Girls. For those unfamiliar with either show in their original form, The Proud Family was a cartoon about the day-to-day life of Penny Proud, a black teenager growing up and facing the everyday struggles that all teenagers do, sometimes touching on things that some kids hadn't ever personally had to deal with, like racial violence, though mostly the show was just simply a slice of life comedy. Powerpuff Girls was a cartoon that was largely a love letter to the classic superhero shows and comics. Three girls with superpowers going around and beating up criminals while also going through everyday things like school, bonding with their dad, and the typical sibling squabbles. It sometimes touched on darker subjects like their failed clone sister, but for the most part, it was just action-packed fun. Each show had an episode that touched on something that hadn't really been addressed before. Something that even back then, most people wouldn't really dare talk about, and the shows today certainly wouldn't. These episodes went at it from different angles, but for the most part, the core message was the same. Having something in your life that may hold you back somehow doesn't mean you're entitled to special treatment or that you can get away with treating other people badly. Nor should you tolerate being taken advantage of or mistreated by others out of pity for their situation or circumstances. This is something I see pop up in arguments online and in real life all the time. No matter how terrible someone is, no matter how much they're harming others, no matter how cruel and vicious and selfish someone's actions may be, if they have a label that makes them part of a marginalized group, people will defend them and say that they're entitled to do those things and act that way because of that particular trait, even if said trait has nothing at all to do with their behavior. For example, I read a post about someone whose adult daughter was destroying his home, tormenting him and his wife, getting herself fired from job after job, demanding money constantly, getting physically violent with him and her mother, breaking their furniture, stealing, and threatening them constantly. Basically, anyone with a lick of sense would tell them to kick her out and she can figure out her own life if she's going to be destructive and violent and entitled like that. But one thing completely changed the narrative for a lot of people in the comments: the fact that she's trans. Her being trans had nothing to do with her actions, and her parents didn't treat her differently for it. From all accounts, they were fully supportive and had paid for her transition, bought her a new wardrobe on her request, well, more of a demand, and had immediately started calling her by her new name and helping her go through the name change process. Her being trans had absolutely nothing to do with her behavior. It was just a side detail. She wasn't a horrible person because she was trans, she was a horrible person who just happened to be trans. However, for a lot of people, that was the only detail that mattered. They said that the stress of being trans was the reason for her stealing, for her being violent, for her refusing to work, for every horrible thing she was doing, and saying that her parents would be monsters if they made her take responsibility for her actions or kicked her out. There was absolutely nothing about her behavior that had anything to do with being trans, but for some reason, for some people, the fact that she's part of a marginalized group excused everything, no matter how violent and destructive. I made a comment pointing out that her being trans wasn't the problem, her being a problem was the problem, and needed to be addressed accordingly. I pointed out my own history with transition because a lot of the time you're basically not allowed to say anything, even if it's just plain common sense or easily proven facts, if you don't have the appropriate quote-unquote credentials to be allowed to speak on it, even if it's only a footnote to the actual conversation being had. Someone responded that I must be a self-hating transphobe because I don't think being trans entitles someone to be a violent, destructive thief and avoid any and all responsibility for their actions. I think most people can say that obviously someone shouldn't get away with terrible behavior because of one trait, but this isn't exactly something that's new. Social experiments have been done that showed two different versions of one scenario: a spouse hitting their partner. When the spouse being aggressive was the man, people intervened constantly. The actor almost got attacked a few times, and people immediately acted to protect the woman. When they reversed the genders and the woman was attacking the man, hitting him and kicking him, no one intervened. People laughed. People took videos on their phone, even cheered her on. In both cases, there was never any clear reason why the attack was happening. The onlookers had no information about what was going on besides the gender of the people involved, and their choices and behavior completely changed based on that one detail. This is still something that happens today. Men who are physically abused by women tend to be shamed into silence or have their problems not taken seriously even when they have clear and serious injuries because of it. But if those men ever retaliate in self defense, it's highly likely that their entire social group will come down on them as if they were the perpetrator the whole time and not reacting to protect themselves. Any harm that has been done to them, no matter how serious, doesn't matter if they so much as breathe wrong in the direction of the person that's harming them, if that person happens to be a woman. And yes, I know that a lot of female victims have a hard time getting justice too and are often dismissed. But on the whole, they tend to be believed and taken seriously much more readily than male abuse victims, especially if the abuser is a woman and thus considered weaker by default. Weaponized victimhood gets used by people a lot of the time, whether intentionally or not, to get away with behaviors and actions that otherwise would be clearly unacceptable. In a nutshell, it's when someone uses a particular trait or traits that they have to excuse any bad behavior or actions they take, regardless of whether or not those traits have resulted in them ever being directly victimized or having anything to do with their actions at all. In the Proud Family episode, Penny gets into trouble because someone has been painting her face and name all over buildings and fences, so she gets accused of vandalism. Her friends know she didn't do it, and La Cienega in particular wants to find out who it was that thinks Penny's face was worth painting on buildings rather than hers because, well, she's just self absorbed like that. So they all go Sherlock Holmes and decide to solve the mystery themselves, since the cops are the typical incompetent type who don't get things done in cartoons. They thought that it was some boys on bikes after finding some tire tracks, and follow them to catch the vandal in the act, who turns out to be a boy in a wheelchair who had become smitten with Penny after seeing her from afar. Penny's name is cleared, but he isn't punished for his actions, not even being made to clean it up because, well, no one wants to punish the kid in a wheelchair. He wanted Penny to date him, and she clearly did not want to, but she also doesn't want to say no and be seen as someone who's mean to the disabled kid. Her dad, Oscar, is the typical protective, no boyfriends until you're 30 and married kind of dad, so she somewhat expected him to put a stop to the whole thing and took the kid to her house. Upon announcing to her dad that her boyfriend was there, Oscar was clearly gearing up for an "oh no, you don't" speech to run off any boy who dared try to date his daughter, but his tone instantly changed the moment he saw who it was. No one wanted to say no to the kid in a wheelchair for fear of being seen as a jerk who is mean to the disabled. The boy takes obvious advantage of this, mistreating Penny and everyone else around him and forcing them to do whatever he wanted, getting away with actions up to and including criminal behavior because no one wanted to be the person that called the cops on a disabled kid or the cop who arrested one. By the end of the episode, however, Penny has had enough and calls him out on everything he's been doing. She tells him that she had let him get away with it all because she felt sorry for him, but she doesn't anymore. And him being in a wheelchair didn't make him a good person, and she didn't owe him anything, and she wasn't going to take being treated that way by anyone, disabled or not, anymore. She dumps him, and the episode ends with people realizing that he shouldn't be allowed to get away with being a terrible person just because he's in a wheelchair. and he has to learn to treat people better if he wants anyone to actually be around him and genuinely be his friend. In the Powerpuff Girls episode, they come up against a new villain called Femme Fatale, an outspoken woman who claims to be a feminist and uses her gender to get out of trouble and justify all her actions. She managed to convince the girls that all men and boys are inherently evil and cruel and would keep them down, making them think that Fatale's actions were driven out of justice and therefore were right, rather than being driven from the more obvious greed and selfish violence they actually stemmed from, and that they couldn't arrest her because if they did, there would be no female villain representation in the town at all, as if that mattered more than anything else. The Powerpuff Girls end up taking her words to heart, to an extent that they begin mistreating all the boys around them, even young classmates. When they see a little boy accidentally bump into a girl and make her fall, even though he's clearly very sorry and apologizes and didn't mean any harm, they pounce on him and threaten him into tears. They treat their dad like trash, despite the fact that he's only ever been loving and kind towards them. They are cruel to male police officers and refuse to listen to the mayor when he tries to tell them about the danger the town is facing because they don't want to take orders from a man. Finally, someone has to step in. Miss Bellum and their teacher, Miss Keene, who hold an intervention to set things straight. They make it very clear that the little boy knocking down a girl was entirely an accident, and getting violent over it wasn't justified. That getting angry at Professor Utonium for asking them to clean their room when he was taking care of all the other chores and building the best life for them he could wasn't fair, and that by not arresting Fatale, they were doing a lot more harm than any good that could come from her being loose. They try to say that they let her go because girls have to look out for one another, to which 3 more people come forward. The female bank president who was robbed, a policewoman who had her arm broken by Fatale, and a teenage girl who, well, apparently she accuses Fatale of stealing her hairstyle, but the other 2 have good points, and ask if Fatale was looking out for them when she hurt them. The girls realize that not only have they been overreacting by treating the men around them badly, but that Fatale is a hypocrite who just tricked them so she could continue her crime spree. Miss Keene and Miss Bellum end the intervention by telling the girls that while they're right about how there will always be injustice in the world, as superheroes, the girls have a duty to protect everyone, regardless of gender. They confront Fatale and ask her if she even knows who Susan B. Anthony is, since Fatale has an obsession with Susan B. Anthony coins, as they're one of the only ones that feature a woman rather than a man. She clearly doesn't, so they explain to her that Susan B. Anthony stood against the rules that wouldn't allow women to do things like vote, and in 1872 she broke the law by voting, something that women couldn't legally do until 1920 when the 19th Amendment was passed. While Susan was found guilty, the authorities wanted to show her leniency and let her go without punishment because she was a woman. Instead of special treatment, Susan wanted to be treated equally to anyone else who broke the law and demanded to be sent to prison just like any man who broke the law would be. The girls give Fatale her rightful beatdown and send her to prison, learning an important lesson about not giving someone who is causing harm special treatment because they have a particular trait that may sometimes mean they weren't treated the way they should have been or have some disadvantages in certain situations. These are lessons that today's shows wouldn't dare tackle. The idea that just because someone belongs to one group, whether it's something like gender, a disability, or race, doesn't excuse their behavior, and if they do things that harm others, they should be punished for it, is something that I don't think any modern show would ever approach. Whether it's a kid in school with an IEP not being punished for threatening or physically assaulting other students or teachers, or someone who is trans mistreating and exploiting everyone around them, or a member of any marginalized race or religion engaging in dangerous and harmful behavior towards others, there are a lot of people who will jump to excuse them and insist that it's not their fault and they deserve to be able to get away with it because of that one trait. I've said it before and I'll say it again. A reason is not the same thing as an excuse. And if your actions or behavior are harming others, you should face consequences for it. It doesn't matter if you're part of a group that was marginalized in the past or present. It doesn't matter what your race is, what your religion is, your nationality, your gender, your sexuality, your physical condition, or if something terrible happened to your people at any point in the past. If you are actively hurting other people, you should be held accountable for it. Being held accountable is the only way people learn from their mistakes and have motivation to be better. If the only reason people tolerate you is pity, well, do you really want to live like that? A world where the only thing about you that makes people stick around is that they feel sorry for you? I know a lot of people have been thriving in the victim mentality and how they feel it frees them from responsibility, but it's no way to live. Even if people feel sorry for you, if you're rancid and toxic, people are going to avoid you as much as possible. You won't get invited to things because anyone wants you there. You won't be included because anyone actually likes you. You won't be anyone's friend or someone they're genuinely happy to see. You'll just exist as something they really wish they could throw out but just feel sorry for. And if you cross a line that justifies them cutting you out permanently, they won't feel bad for doing so and will forget about you while you're left alone without anyone who genuinely cares about you or wants to support you out of love, only obligation. And really, do you want to live that way? Being around people who only tolerate you out of pity or obligation sure sounds like hell to me, but I actually put effort into making the people around me happy, so maybe that's just a me thing. But I really hope everyone else is willing to try and be the kind of person that others would actually want to be around. And I really hope that people learn not to tolerate people who are harming them, who insult them, who treat them badly just because they feel guilty that this person has something in their life, whether it's something physical, something mental, something racial, or any other reason that makes them feel like they're obligated to stay that person's friend, even if that person is clearly using them or mistreating them. You don't owe them anything. You don't owe somebody your time, your effort, just because maybe at some point in their life they might have gotten slightly less than great treatment or they have something that might hold them back a bit. You don't owe them anything. Nobody does. If somebody is not a good person, then treat them like the bad person they are, no matter what kind of traits or other things that they have about them that might try to make people justify their behavior. It's not justified. Thank you all for joining me for this one. I know it was a little more on the controversial side, but I think these conversations are important, both for people who might be getting taken advantage of and those who need to realize that it's okay to drop people who treat them badly, even if they have something that tends to make people grant them a victim label and give them more leeway, or for people who might be weaponizing their own conditions or traits, whether they realize it or not, and may need a little push to realize that it's wrong and they need to do better. The world is still a scary, scary place right now, and I hope all of you and your loved ones are safe and can give each other the strength to get through. Keep an eye on what's happening around you, but also give your brain and your heart a break sometimes and try to give yourself the grace to keep yourself from getting overwhelmed by everything in the world right now. Be safe, eat healthy, stay hydrated, get some rest, and I'll see you in the next one.